On an old dusty path lined by wild flowers and shrubs, they were seen three ancient-looking women taking a leisurely stroll through the village. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long shadows on the dusty path. The sky was painted with shades of orange and pink, and soft breeze rustled the leaves of the palm trees, providing a welcoming reprieve from the day's heat. They leaned heavily on their walking sticks, each step accompanied by a slight shuffle and the creak of old bones. Their laughter and chatter filled the air, a comforting rhythm of familiarity and shared history. As they made their way down the path, they spotted a young girl sitting under the udara tree, her head bowed and her shoulders hunched, as if burdened by an invisible weight. She was the hunched daughter of the village palm wine tapper, whose visage garnered pity or wrath, depending on who saw her. The sight of the girl immediately shifted the tone of their conversation. One of the old women, who was called Mama Gozie, was known for her sharp tongue and keen eyes. She tilted her head and sighed deeply. "Ah, poor Ifoma," she began, her voice tinged with both pity and a hint of scorn. "She reminds me of the daughter of one of the kings long ago. Have you too forgotten?" she asked her companion as they all paused, trying to remember. "You two are always behaving as if the ancestors are already calling you to come join them," she said irritably, as she saw they couldn't remember. "It is you the ancestors are calling, evil mouth." The second woman, known as Mama Obinna, retorted, getting riled up. "Please, please, please, you two should stop it. We are in the middle of the road, for God's sake." The third woman, called Mama Kechi, said, coming to stand between them before they will start with their sticks. "I remember now the story you speak of," she quickly added to distract them. "Is it not the story of the third daughter of King Ibezue, known throughout the land as the ugly princess?" "That is the story," Mama Ngozi exclaimed, forgetting her anger immediately as they continued on their way as if nothing had happened. The women fell silent for a moment, each lost in their thought about the girl under the udara tree and their ugly princess of long ago. The breeze grew cooler, and the sky darkened a little more, as if mourning the young princess's fate. "But you know," Mama Ngozi said, breaking the silence, her voice softer now, "I sometimes wonder if perhaps her fate is tied to something greater than we can see. They say the spirits work in ways we do not understand. Perhaps she was given her faith so that she might find a strength and a purpose that her sisters with all their beauty could never have known." "Who do you speak of?" Mama Bina asked flippantly, still a bit lost in her own thoughts. "It is your daughter in her father's house, you foolish woman. Of course I am talking about Princess Iruma," Mama Ngozi said angrily. "Why do you always need explanation for everything?" she asked incredulously. "It is you who is foolish," Mama Obinna replied, getting angry again. "How can you jump from one story to the other without proper explanation? Who amongst us here can read your mind?" she said, while raising her walking stick to land a painful hit on her companion's arm. Mama Nkechi, tired of their incessant quarrels, left them to it and continued her stroll as if she didn't see anything. "They will sort themselves out," she said. She was much too old to be beaten by two foolish and angry old women. When the other two saw that their mediator had left them alone, they disengaged and quickly followed her, while still engaged in exchange of words. Some of the villagers coming back from the farm all avoided them because trying to settle their quarrels usually makes you the enemy. Everyone knows them too well to intervene in their matter, even though their wisdom and knowledge is often sought after as they have lived for so long. But when it comes to the clash between the three, nobody dares intervene. They always have their own ways of settling their quarrels without external interference. So when they finally caught up to the third woman, they continued their conversation as if nothing had happened. The question I asked, nobody said anything, no. Mama Ngozi said, well, Mama Nkechi began to avert another war. You act as if you don't know how her story ended. But before they could continue, they had gotten to their compound, their grandchildren already seated under the mango tree waiting for tonight's tale. The three looked at each other and smiled, already knowing what story would be told tonight. As they sat gingerly on their designated chairs, looking at the eager, innocent faces of their grandchildren, their thoughts drifted back to the tales of the ugly princess, a girl who seemed destined for a fate as shadowed and complex as the night she was born. Are you all ready, children, for another adventure into the folklores of the past? Yes, Mama, the children chorused, jumping up in their seats out of excitement. The grandma's tales are always the best. Story, story, Mama Ngozi began. Story, the children chorused excitedly. As the three old women settled into their seats beneath the mango tree, the night wrapped around them like an old familiar blanket. The air was thick with the sounds of crickets, and a soft breeze carried the scent of wood smoke from nearby hearths. The children, already captivated, waited for the story to begin. The first old woman, her voice low and gravelly, started softly, as if speaking from a distant memory. Long ago, in a kingdom where the sun was always bright, there lived a king named Ibizwe, known for his wisdom and his love of beauty. He had three daughters, each of whom was more beautiful than the last. Also, it was said. But it was the third daughter, Iruma, who was talked about most of all, though not for the reasons one might expect. The children shuffled closer, intrigued already. Mama Bina, with a soft voice, continued. Iruma was born on a night when the moon hid behind dark clouds and the wind howled as if the spirits themselves were displeased. Her name, Iruma, which means the beautiful face, was chosen by her mother, the queen, just before she died, in hopes that her daughter would grow into the name. But from the moment she was born, people whispered about her face, her large eyes, her crooked nose, her skin that was not too smooth, and to them she was not beautiful, and her name was not worth it. But Iruma had eyes like a doe, beautiful, clear, and slanted. But people could not look past the physical appearance to notice the beauty that was in her eyes. From the moment Iruma came into the world, her father, King Ibezwe, could not bear to look at her. It was not the kind of rejection you could see on his face. It was in the way his eyes never lingered on her. The way he smiled never reached her when she entered the room. His other two daughters were graceful. They were the pride of the kingdom, but Iruma, she paused, letting the weight of those unspoken words hang in the air. Iruma, Mama Ngozi resumed, was a girl who understood early what it meant to be invincible. In the palace where her sisters were dressed in fine silks and jewels, Iruma would slip away unnoticed to the library. The library, a vast and forgotten place, was where the kingdom's oldest scrolls and books were kept. No one went there except her. The children were drawn deeper into the story, their imaginations painting pictures of the lonely princess in the dusty halls of the palace. In the library, the second woman continued, Iruma found a world where beauty didn't matter. She read about kingdoms long forgotten, about great warriors and wise women. She devoured stories of those who, despite their outward appearance, changed the course of history. And in those stories, she began to see a worth for herself. But even as she found solace in the books, Iruma could not escape the way the world saw her. Whenever there was an event that she could not avoid in the kingdom, Whispers followed her like a shadow wherever she came out. Her sisters, oblivious to their own cruelty, would laugh at her behind closed doors, calling her names. One of the children, a girl with wild, curious eyes, raised her hand. "Didn't she get angry, Mama?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying a note of indignation. But Mama Nkechi shook her head slowly. "No, my little one. Anger did not come easily to Iruma. It wasn't that she didn't feel the sting of their words or their mockery. She felt it every way possible, like a stone lodged in her chest. But the princess had learned something in the quietness of the library. Anger could burn, yes, but it could also destroy. And so she did not want to be destroyed or to destroy. The children nodded and continued to listen, transfixed as the story continued. Above the side remarks, judgmental side talks, and hidden mockery in the palace and in the entire kingdom, it was her father's indifference that weighed most heavily on the princess. Every year during the kingdom's festival, King Ibezwe would present his other daughters to the people, a tradition that symbolizes the kingdom's strength and beauty. Iruma's sisters would wear their finest, their faces painted, their heads held high. But Iruma, despite being presented with them, was often placed at the back, hidden from view, as if her presence was something to be ashamed of. Yet, despite all of this, Iruma never showed her pain. Instead, she grew more determined. She spent hours reading, not just reading, but learning. She studied the ancient ways of governance, the history of her people, the art of strategy. Whatever she could lay her hands on, Iruma read. This led her into the older, almost forgotten sections of the library. She became wise, so wise beyond her years, though no one in the palace cared to know. One of the boys with a furrowed brow asked, "But why didn't her father love her? After all, she was his daughter." The women exchanged glances, their faces shadowed with unspoken truth. Sometimes, people cannot see past the surface. The king was a man who valued outward beauty above all else. To him, Iruma's face was a constant reminder of something he could not control, something that didn't fit his perfect vision of the world. And also he saw her ugliness as the reason his beloved wife died. But Iruma had something her father and sisters lacked: resilience and love. And it was this that would soon be tested. One year, a terrible drought struck the kingdom. Soon enough, the crops began to wither, the rivers dried up, and the people began to suffer. The king, desperate for a solution, turned to the gods, offering sacrifices and praying for rain. But nothing worked. The people grew restless, and rumors began to spread that the kingdom was cursed. Iruma, watching from the shadows, knew that the kingdom's salvation did not lie in rituals or the false promises of the priest. She had read about such droughts in the ancient texts, and she knew that the solution lay in the forgotten wells, buried deep within the kingdom's borders. These wells had been sealed for centuries, only located whenever there is extreme drought and famine, as the kingdom was witnessing now. Their locations, though, was unknown, because it was written that the wells only reveals itself to a worthy person. Iruma brought the ancient text and reports to her father, and he called a meeting of the council. A plan was drafted on how they will send their most trustworthy warriors to uncover the wells and bring back water to the land. The warriors and the wise men left with the ancient scrolls and went in search of the wells. But many months, their search was unsuccessful, and they began to doubt the truth about the well. When they returned, they were angry and agitated. The king and the people were very disappointed, and in great anger, the king called Iruma and scolded her for deceiving him, commanding her to be locked up in her room until his anger subsided. Her sisters, who were initially angry that she was about to be recognized by the kingdom despite her deformity, became happy when she was punished by the king. One night after many days, Iruma woke up from a dream and after much thought decided to follow the instructions that she had received in that dream. After days of making her plans, she started by hiding away parts of her dried food and bread and began timing the guards to know when their shift ends. When everything was perfect as she wanted, without telling anyone, Iruma left the palace in the dead of the night. She slipped away through the window and went in search of the well as her mother had instructed her in the dream. She ventured into the barren land, following the old maps she had taken from the library. The journey was long and perilous, but Iruma did not stop. She knew that the fate of her people rested on her shoulders. Getting to the location indicated in the map, she was a bit confused because everywhere was filled with shrubs, trees, and overgrown grass. Luckily, she had kept a secret map that she discovered before her father locked her up. And on consulting the ancient map, she was able to trace her way amongst the overgrown shrubs. And finally, she located the entrance to a cave where the ancient wells were supposed to be located. The well seemed to have changed the landscape of the forest as it was in a different location than the recent map said, which could explain why the search team from her father were not able to locate it. After days of searching, Iruma found the hidden wells. She worked hard, night and day, to uncover each of them, and soon the waters flowed once again. The rivers were filled without rain, and the kingdom was saved. But no one knew who they were to thank, because Iruma returned to the palace quietly without any fanfare, content to let her father take the credit. Meanwhile, during her absence, her sisters had forced the guards guarding her to wait a few days before reporting to their father, convincing them that they will get into trouble and promising them that Iruma will return like she told them before their father will notice, as she was just trying to put everyone into confusion. But they had only hoped that she never returns because her ugliness was very offensive to them. When the rivers filled up again, the king gave orders for Iruma to be released from her confinement because his heart was now merry. The gods had heard his cry and the kingdom was saved, he exclaimed. The guards took advantage of the king's release order and didn't report her absence again. After a few weeks, Iruma returned to the palace one night, exhausted, bruised, and hungry. When she got to her room, she was surprised to see that the guards were no longer at her door, and she didn't hear any rumors on her way back about a search party sent to look for her. She quietly entered her room and laid on the floor, exhausted and heartbroken. So if she had died from this journey, no one would have known or cared. All her life she had learned to accept herself and her circumstances, but never had she given herself room to question why people were the way they were, especially her own family. Would her life have been better if her mother was alive, she wondered, tears slipping from her eyes and dropping on the carpet that she lay. She can't remember the last time she cried, but right now, if the pain in her heart is not let out somehow, her heart might actually break into pieces. How could no one, absolutely no one, notice that she had not been in the palace for weeks now? Not her maid, not the cooks, not even the guards stationed at her door. Would it have been better if she never returned? All these were running through her broken heart. Exhausted, bruised, and heartbroken, Iroma lay on the floor of her room. The walls around her felt heavy, as if they were closing in on her soul. The ache inside her heart was unbearable, so deep that it felt as if it might actually consume her entirely. Weeks had passed since she left, and life in the palace had continued without her, as if her existence had been of no consequences. The question swelled in her mind, heavy and relentless. Would things have been much different if mother was alive? She wondered, tears slipping down her cheeks. Her mother had left her too soon, the one person who might have loved her without condition. the only one who might have seen beyond her face. As her thoughts drifted deeper into sorrow, sleep claimed her. She saw herself standing at the entrance of the ancient cave. The air around her was warm and fragrant, filled with the scent of blooming flowers and fresh earth after rain. Iridescent lights danced in the air like glowing fireflies, casting a soft shimmer across the landscape. She stepped forward, her bare feet sinking into the lush green grass that stretched endlessly into all directions. A crystal clear stream meandered through the field, catching the light in brilliant hues of blues and silver. The stream fed into a pool at the base of a cascading waterfall, the water tumbling gently over smooth stones, filling the air with a soothing sound. Above her shimmered with colors she had never seen, emerald greens and soft purples, blending seamlessly with streaks of gold. Strange and beautiful butterflies flew through the sky, their wings catching the iridescent light as they made sounds that echoed through the air like melodies from another world. At the center of this paradise stood a rock made of white stone, polished to a mirror-like sheen. Ivy draped around it, blooming with flowers that glowed faintly, as if kissed by starlight. Iluma's heart felt lighter here, the ache in her chest momentarily forgotten. The beauty around her seemed to embrace her, wearing upon her like soft linen, as if whispering that she was finally home. But it wasn't the paradise that stole her breath. It was the figure atop the glowing rock, seeming to wait for her. There, amidst the cascading water and soft glow, stood her mother. Her presence was otherworldly, her skin radiant and smooth like moonlight on still waters. Her long hair flowed freely, glimmering like strands of silver silk. She wore a gown that shimmered with every color of the sky, and her eyes, those same doe-like eyes that Iruma had inherited, were filled with love, warmth, and understanding. "Mother," Iruma whispered, her voice trembling with disbelief. Her mother smiled, and it was a smile that reached deep into Iruma's soul, filling the empty spaces that had been carved by years of rejection and loneliness. "Yes, my beautiful one," her mother had said softly, her voice as soothing as a lullaby. "I have missed you, my child." Without hesitation, Iruma had run to her mother, tears streaming down her face. The warmth of her mother's arms wrapped around her felt so familiar, holding her close. In her embrace, Iruma felt something she had longed for all her life: love. "I missed you," Iruma whispered. "I have always missed you." Her voice choked with emotion. "Everything has been so hard, mother. No one cares, no one notices. I don't know if I belong anywhere." Her mother kissed the top of her head and gently wiped away her tears. "I know, my child," she whispered. "I have seen everything, the pain, the loneliness, the way the world has treated you unfairly. But I want you to know that you are not alone, and you are not forgotten." Iruma looked up at her mother, confusion clouding her gaze. But why? Why was I given this face? Why was I made to carry this burden? Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with both sorrow and pride. "Because, my dear Iruma, you were chosen for a purpose greater than what others can see. Your beauty was never meant to be measured by your face, but by your heart, your strength, and your kindness. You were given this path so that you could learn to find your true self, not in the approval of others, but in giving what you have been denied." Iruma's heart ached with what her mother was saying. The love she had long sought from her father, her sisters, and her people had always been out of reach. But here, in this place, she realized that that love she needed had been within her all along. Her mother guided her to the edge of the shining stream and cupped her hands in the water, offering Iruma a drink. The water glowed faintly, shimmering with the same iridescent light that filled the air. "Drink, my child," her mother whispered. "This water is a gift, a reflection of the love and strength that you carry within you. Let it heal the wounds that you have hidden deep in your heart. Iruma knelt beside her mother and dipped her hands into the cool glowing water. As she brought it to her lips, the water tasted sweeter than anything she had ever known. With each sip, she felt a warmth spread through her body, soothing the pain and lifting the weight that had pressed on her soul for so long. The bruises on her skin faded, and the exhaustion that had clung to her melted away. As Iruma drank from the stream, the glow within her body grew brighter, radiating outward. It was as if every part of her, her mind, her body, and her spirit, was being renewed and strengthened. For the first time in her life, Iruma felt whole. Her mother knelt beside her, placing a gentle hand on her cheek. "Remember, my child," she whispered. "You are more than what the world sees. Your journey is not over yet. But know this, you have the strength to carry on, and I will always be with you no matter where your path leads." Tears welled up in Iruma's eyes again, but they were no longer tears of sorrow. They were tears of hope, gratitude, and acceptance. "I love you, mother," she whispered. Her mother smiled, her image glowing brighter. "And I love you, my beautiful one. Now go, your people need you once again." With those words, her mother kissed her forehead, and the paradise around her dissolved into soft light, and the sound of the stream and waterfalls echoed like a distant melody as Iruma drifted peacefully out of sleep. As she awoke with a start, her body still warm from the dream, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She lay still for a moment, savoring the feeling of peace that lingered in her chest. The memory of her mother's embrace was etched deeply into her soul, and the taste of the stream water still lingered on her tongue. Iruma puzzled, wondered how she knew the woman was her mother, but somehow her soul had known. It had called out to the woman who she saw and had identified her as mother. And for the first time, Iruma knew, truly knew, that she was enough. She had been given a gift greater than beauty, the strength to heal, the wisdom to endure, and a heart capable of loving even those who did not deserve it. And with that knowledge, Iruma knew what she had to do. She would rise again, not for recognition, not for praise, but because she had the power to make a difference. As the sun rose over the kingdom, Iruma got up from the floor where she had fallen asleep and went to have a bath. It was when she was putting on her clothes she realized that something was off. But she couldn't tell what it was until she remembered that she had sustained some bruises on her way back from the cave of wells. But there was none on her body now, and the aches had disappeared. She checked her body all over, but couldn't find any of the bruises. She stood for a while pondering on this. She wondered if it had anything to do with the dream, but then again, how can a dream miraculously heal a physical wound? She wondered incredulously. At last she filed it away to examine later as her stomach growled with hunger. She hadn't eaten any hot meals since she left the palace, and in spite of everything, she needed to eat. When she stepped into the dining hall, her sisters stood up in shock, staring at her like she had 10 heads. Iruma ignored them and curtsied to her father, who did as he always does, as if she wasn't there. She wanted to sit, but changed her mind at the last second. She loaded a tray with all her eyes could see on the table, her sisters and the servants staring at her. But Iruma had made peace with herself and the world around her, so she didn't feel the familiar ache that usually accompanies such stares. Rather, she felt freed and nonchalant. When she had taken what she thinks she can finish, she politely excused herself and walked back into her room. She was surprised to see her maid doing some cleaning when she entered. In order not to disturb her, Iruma took her tray of food to the library, the place of her sanctuary, and felt at peace immediately. The moldy smell of old books and the comforting silence making her feel better. She had missed this place. Of all the places in the entire kingdom, this was her favorite. She smiled gently as she placed a tray of food on a table and sat down to dine. She laid hold on the closest book and began where she left off, getting lost as usual in the printed words. She didn't realize when she finished her breakfast and when the midday sun reflected across the shelves. She only came back to the present when a hand tapped her shoulders and she turned around shaking. It was her maid, Ifoma. "It is past time for lunch, my princess," she said, curtsying. Iruma was surprised at her, even though Ifoma had never outrightly behaved like everyone else. But she had never been disrespectful. "I ate full breakfast, so I am not hungry." "Oh," Ifoma said, looking at the tray she was carrying with confusion. Iruma followed her gaze and saw that she had brought her a tray of food. She was surprised again, but in her straightforward approach to life, Iruma asked, "Why are you suddenly being nice?" Ifeoma seemed to have been taken aback with that question. She hesitated, her hands tightening on the edges of the tray that she carried. Her gaze flickered between Iruma and the food, as if trying to summon the right words. Finally, she drew in a shaky breath and said softly, I, I owe you an apology, my princess." Iruma blinked momentarily, taken aback. "An apology?" she echoed. "Yes," Ifeoma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I have thought a lot about how I have treated you, how I ignore your kindness and the generosity you always showed to me and my family. And even though you never stopped treating me with respect, I behaved no better than anyone else in this entire kingdom." Ifeoma's voice faltered as she continued. "While you were gone, I had time to reflect. I don't know where you went or what happened, but it made me realize just how much I took you for granted. And the truth is, you have always been good to me, even when no one else was. You never raised your voice at me, even when I deserved it. You never treated me with anything less than kindness." Iruma, shocked, remained silent, stunned by the sincerity in Ifeoma's words. It wasn't often she had such honesty directed at her, and certainly not from one of the few people who had been closest to her in the palace. Tears welled up in Ifeoma's eyes, and she quickly wiped them away with the back of her hand. "I don't expect your forgiveness right away, my princess," she continued, "but I want to do better. I want to be the maid you deserve, starting now." Iruma gazed at Ifeoma for a long time, her emotions swirling. This was the first time anyone had ever acknowledged the pain she had carried, the silent burden she bore every day. A flicker of warmth stirred in her chest, but she kept her expression calm. "Thank you, Ifeoma," Iruma said quietly. "It takes courage to say what you have said, and if you truly wish to do better, I welcome it." Ifeoma gave a small grateful nod. "I brought lunch for you," she said, glancing down at the tray in her hands. "I thought you might be hungry, my princess." Iruma shook her head. "I am not actually. Like I said, I ate a full breakfast. But thank you for thinking of me." With another nod, Ifeoma collected the empty breakfast tray and curtsied once more, her gaze lingering on Iruma with a newfound respect. "I will leave you to your reading then, my princess." Iruma watched her maid leave, a strange sense of relief settling over her. The apology was unexpected, but it felt like a small crack in the wall that had long separated her from the rest of the world. For the first time in a long while, she felt seen, not for her appearance, but for who she was. She turned back to her book, eager to lose herself once more in its words. As she opened the pages, a slip of parchment fluttered out and landed softly on the table. Frowning, Iruma picked it up, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It read, "When the soul aligns with the purpose it was born to fulfill, the body too will reflect its transformation. Water that cleanses the spirit cannot help but heal the flesh." Iruma's heart quickened as she stared at the words. They felt like a message written directly for her, as if the ancient scribe had known of her journey, her dream, and the water she had drank from the shining stream. Life went on quietly though for Iruma, her days unfolding in peaceful solitude. To her surprise, her sisters began to avoid her, casting nervous glances her way whenever they crossed paths in the palace halls. Iruma couldn't understand what had changed, but she was grateful for it nonetheless. She does not have the strength to deal with her sisters. She had always wished her sisters would give her a chance. She had long accepted that it wasn't something she could force. Now, as she wandered the palace freely, undisturbed by their scornful remarks, she found a new sense of peace. Loving them from a distance is enough, she thought. Solitude, which she had once seen as a curse, was now revealing itself to be a rare gift, a quiet sanctuary where she could finally breathe and be herself. Iruma spent most of her days in the library, surrounded by the wisdom of the ancient texts. The quiet comfort of old books, the scent of parchment, and the peaceful hush of the library became her refuge. Her transformation, though subtle and still unfolding, felt natural, like she was slowly aligning with a truth she had known but never fully embraced. Months after Iruma's journey to the cave, a shadow fell over the kingdom. King Ibezue fell gravely ill. What began as a mild discomfort worsened rapidly, and soon the once proud ruler was confined to his chambers, too weak to leave his bed. The best healers from across the kingdom were summoned, and the palace was filled with the scent of herbs, roots, and healing oils. But nothing seemed to work. Each day, the king grew weaker, and with every passing moment, the elders and wise men grew more anxious. No potion, no chant, no herb brought any relief. The halls of the palace echoed with the murmurs of fear and hopelessness. Iruma watched the event unfold from the sidelines. No one asked for her help. No one ever did anyway. Her sisters, once so radiant and confident, stayed far from the king's chambers, afraid of the sickness and more concerned with preserving their beauty and status than attending to their father. The irony was not lost on Iruma. Her sisters had always backs in the king's law, yet in his time of need they were nowhere to be found. One night, the palace lay steeped in silence, heavy with the weight of fear and uncertainty. The air thick with sorrow. Iruma stood at the entrance of her father's chamber, her heart heavy. Though the king had never shown her love nor acceptance, he was still her father. And despite everything, a quiet part of her longed to ease his suffering, even if he never acknowledged her presence. She carried a simple wooden cup filled with water, water she had drawn from a secret jar hidden in the library. The water sparkled faintly, as if touched by the moonlight. Though there was no light in the room to explain it, it was from the hidden well. She had taken a part of the water directly from the well itself, the day that she had unstopped it. Though she did not fully understand the power of the water, but she had felt that she needed to take it back with her on that day. She felt it in her heart that it could help her father. As Iruma stepped into the king's chamber, the air shifted slightly. The soft rustling of her gown, the only sound. The chamber was dimly lit by flickering oil lamps, casting shadows on the walls. The attendants, healers, and elders present turned to stare at her, startled by her quiet entrance. "What are you doing here?" one of the wise men asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. Without answering, Iruma moved gracefully towards her father's bedside. The king lay motionless, his chest rising and falling with labored breath. His once majestic presence had faded, replaced by the frailty of a man at the brink of death. She knelt beside him, holding out the cup. "Let him drink this," she said simply, her voice calm and unwavering. The elders exchanged glances, unsure of what to do. One of the healers, a cautious man with tired eyes, furrowed his brow. "What is it, princess?" he asked, eyeing the shimmering water with distrust. "It is water," Iroma replied simply. "Why are you bringing water to the king?" another queried her harshly. Iroma turned and said, "He is my father, and I know I don't have the wisdom of the wise or the tale of the healers. But I love my father, and this is the token of that love." The room fell into silence, as no one could refute her simple but truthful words. The healers hesitated, and the silence stretched thin in the room. They whispered among themselves, skeptical of the princess they had always dismissed. But then one of them, an older healer who had long observed the indifference towards Iroma, said, "She is the only one of his children who cared enough to come. Give him the gift she had brought." The room fell silent once more, and with a sigh, the old healer reached out, gently taking the cup from Iroma's hand. He studied her for a moment, seeing something in her gaze, something different, something resolute. He turned away and bent towards the king, carefully tilting the cup to his lips. "Drink, your majesty," he murmured. The king stared faintly, his lips parting as the healer poured the water into his mouth, a few drops at a time. He let out a long sigh, as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his chest. The healers exchanged astonished glances. Iruma sat back on her heels, watching quietly, a strange sense of peace washing over her. Not triumph, not pride, but a quiet contentment. She had done what she came to do. She had given her father a chance, even if he had never given her one. The old healer placed the empty cup with a little drop inside on the bedside table. His eyes filled with the quiet gratitude as he looked at Iroma. "Thank you, princess," he whispered, bowing his head slightly. Iroma nodded and simply said, "Good night," rising to her feet. Without another word, she turned and left the chamber, her footsteps light and sure. As she stepped back into the quiet corridors of the palace, the night air cool against her skin, a thought settled gently in her mind. She was more than the reflection in others' eyes. She always has been. The healers remained awake through the night, keeping vigil by the king's bedside. But as the hours passed and there was no visible change, fatigue began to settle over them. One by one, they all drifted off and slept, exhaustion claiming them. The first light of dawn crept into the chamber, casting soft golden rays across the stone floor. The stillness was broken only by the sound of slow, steady breathing, the sound of a man at rest. Then a voice, groggy but full of life, cut through the silence. "Why is everyone in my bedchamber?" The attendants jerked awake, their eyes wide with disbelief. They turned towards the bed where King Ibezwe was sitting up, his gaze sharp but filled with confusion. He looked around at the room full of dozing figures and frowned. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, as if waking from a long nap rather from a near-fatal illness. The healer stared at him, mouths agape, struggling to comprehend what they were seeing. The man who had been at death's door mere hours ago now sat upright, his skin clear, his eyes bright with the authority he had once wielded. The old healer stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Your Majesty, you were gravely sick. We feared you could not make it." The king's brow furrowed. "You?" He looked down at his hands, flexing his fingers as if testing them. "But I feel fine." The attendants exchanged astonished glances, unable to reconcile the man before them with the frail figure they had attended to just hours earlier. One of the younger healers whispered in awe, "It is a miracle." The old healer turned towards the empty cup, resting on the bedside table. The memory of Iroma's quiet visit resurfacing. He whispered under his breath, "Princess." It was her. Word of the king's miraculous recovery spread quickly through the palace, though no one could explain how it had happened. The healers and elders were left to speculate, but the truth, known only to a few, was that it was Iruma's water that had saved him. The king now held him, carried on as if nothing had happened. When his daughters came to visit him later that day, he welcomed them with the same favoritism he had always shown, oblivious to Iruma's absence amongst them. She spent the day in the library as usual, reading her ancient texts and basking in the peace she had found within herself. She had not performed the act of kindness for recognition, nor had she sought her father's approval. She had done it because it was the right thing to do, and that she knew was more than enough. It has been some days since the recovery of King Ibezwe. On this bright morning, As the sun filtered gently through the windows of his chamber, casting soft beams over the stone walls, King Ibezue sat upright in his bed, lost in thought. Though his strength has been fully restored, his mind was still clouded with confusion. Even though he had acted like he doesn't remember, but the events of the past weeks felt distant, like a heavy fog he was only now emerging from. He was still pondering his miraculous recovery when the door creaked open and the old healer entered quietly. The man bowed low, his expression thoughtful as he approached the king's bedside. Your Majesty, the healer began cautiously, I see that you are feeling much better now. King Ibezue nodded. Yes, but I do not understand it. Some nights ago I felt death's hand upon me, and now I awaken as though nothing happened. Tell me, what was done? The healer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Your Majesty, none of the herbs or remedies we used had any effect. But the night before your miraculous recovery, your youngest daughter, Princess Iruma, came quietly into your chamber. She brought with her a cup of water. The healer's gaze softened, and now you sit before us, alive and well. It is my belief, Your Majesty, that whatever water the princess gave you was what saved your life. The room fell into a heavy silence as the weight of the healer's words settled over the king. Ibezue's face, changed and regal for as long as anyone could remember, seemed to falter, as if he were suddenly carrying the burden of a lifetime's worth of regrets. Alone now in his chamber after the healer's departure, King Ibezue stared at the words, lost in thought. The words, your youngest daughter, echoed painfully in his mind. His heart felt as heavy as stone, and the memory of his wife resurfaced unbidden, like a forgotten promise rising from the depths. He could still see her, lying weak and exhausted from childbirth, her face pale but glowing with love as she cradled their newborn daughter. Despite the child's misshapen features, the queen had smiled and whispered to him, please call her Iruma, for she is going to be the most beautiful of them all. But he hadn't been able to see it. He hadn't been able to know what his wife had known. He had only seen the child's deformities and the cruel omen they had represented. His heart, full of fear and anger, had hardened, and that night he had knelt beside his wife and made a promise, one he now realized he had broken without a thought. He had said, I will love her no matter what. Yet for years, he had done the opposite. He had turned away from his own child, treating her not as a blessing but as a burden, a shadow to be hidden from the world. His rejection of Iruma had been so complete that he had scarcely acknowledged nor remembered her existence. But still, when death had come for him, it was Iruma, the doctor he had cast aside, who had come to his aid. The thought pierced his heart with a sorrow deeper than any he had ever known. She had saved him, not for recognition, not for approval, but out of love. Because if she had done it for any of those reasons, the few days that he had been up and about, she would have come to seek for his presence. But for these past few days, he had not set eyes on her, and no one, as usual, has brought her up before him. He rested his head in his hands, overwhelmed with the weight of his failure as a father. How could I have been so blind, he thought bitterly. All this time he had such strength and beauty in his other children. Yet it was Iruma, kind, selfless, and resilient, who had shown him the truest form of love. For he had been told of his other daughter's absence from his chambers while he was at death's door. Although he pondered at what kind of water Iroma had given him, but whatever it was she who had shown him the love that he had denied her. As the hours passed, the king's mind remained heavy with regret. He thought of all the moments he had ignored Iroma, the chances he had missed to show her the love she deserved, and yet, despite his neglect, She had come to him in his darkest hour, bringing with her not just water, but a lifeline. He knew now what he had to do. It was not enough to acknowledge her in private. It was time to right the wrongs he had committed and fulfill the promise he had once made to her mother. He rose slowly from bed, steadying himself as he stood up. His attendants rushed in, still astonished to see him standing on his feet, pale and hearty. But he waved them away, his expression resolute. "I must see my daughter," he said firmly. "I must see Iruma." The king found Iruma where he had been told she would be, in the palace library. She sat at one of the large wooden tables, her nose buried in an old book, the tray from her breakfast pushed to the side. For a moment he stood at the doorway watching her in silence. She looked so at peace, so content in the solitude that had been forced upon her. And yet, even in that stillness, he could see the quiet strength that had carried her through the years. He took a deep breath, then stepped forward. The sound of his footsteps startled Iruma, and she looked up, her doe-like eyes wide with surprise. "Father," she whispered, as if unsure whether he was truly there. He approached her slowly, each step weighed down by the enormity of what he needed to say. When he reached her, he knelt before her, much to her shock. The king, the man who had scarcely acknowledged her existence, was kneeling at her feet, his head bowed in humility, and she knelt down not knowing what to do as well. "Iruma," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "I have failed you. I have failed you in ways no father ever should. I turned my back on you when you needed me most. I did not see you for who you truly are, a gift and not a burden. And yet, despite everything, you have come to save my life. You gave me water when I gave you nothing." Tears welled up in Iruma's eyes, but she said nothing, stunned by the vulnerability in her father's words. "I made a promise to your mother the night you were born," he continued, his voice trembling. "I promised that I would love you no matter what. I broke that promise, but I am here now and I beg your forgiveness. I do not deserve it, but I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the father that you deserve." For a long moment there was only silence between them. Then slowly, Iruma reached out and placed her hand on her father's hand. The gesture was small, but it was all he needed. "I forgive you," she whispered, her voice soft and trembling. "Not just because you asked, but because I need you to know that I hold no grudge against you." The king looked at her, tears glistening in his eyes unbidden. In that moment, he saw his daughter for the first time. Not as a child born beneath a shroud of misfortune, but as the woman she had become, strong, kind, and radiant in ways that went beyond appearances. And for the first time in his life, King Ibizwe smiled at Iruma, not out of duty, not out of obligation, but out of his heart. From that day forward, the king made good on his promise. Though the past could not be changed, he worked tirelessly to earn his daughter's trust. He invited her into his council, what he has never done for any of his children. He sought her wisdom and gave her the respect she had always deserved. And Iruma, though she had come to cherish her solitude, found peace in the quiet reconciliation between herself and the father she had once thought lost to her forever. The palace halls echoed with new beginnings, and though not all wounds could be healed in a day, the love that grew between father and daughter was proof that even the most broken promises could be mended if only one had the courage to try. One morning, the first light of dawn spilled gently through the window of Iruma's room, warming the air and casting soft shadows on the walls. Iruma stared beneath her blanket, awakening slowly, the events of the previous day still fresh in her mind, the reconciliation with her father, the weight of his apology, and the healing of old wounds she had carried for so long. She sat up in bed, rubbing her eyes and stretching her limbs, but something felt different. She stilled. her hands running across her body, and then she noticed it. The ache that had plagued her back for as long as she could remember was gone. She sat up straighter, stunned. Her hand drifted to the small mirror resting on her bedside table. As she brought it up to her face, her breath caught in her throat. Her reflection was unrecognizable. Her skin, once blotchy, rough, and marked by imperfections, was now smooth, glowing with a radiance like that of a newborn. Her back, which had been hunched for years, was straight and elegant. Even her features, which the world had once deemed flawed, now seemed perfectly aligned, framed by luminous eyes that glimmered with warmth. Iruma touched her cheek in disbelief, feeling the softness beneath her fingers. She looked at her hands and arms, marveling at the smoothness of her skin. It was as if the years of rejection and sorrow had been wiped away in one night. Her body had become as new as her heart. Iruma had barely processed the miraculous change when the door swung open. Ifoma, her maid, stepped inside, balancing a tray of water and fresh linens. But the moment Ifoma's eye fell on Iruma, she froze. Her expression twisted in shock and confusion. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "And what are you doing in my princess's room?" Iruma smiled, amused by Ifoma's confusion. "It is me, Ifoma. I am Iruma." Ifoma took a step back, shaking her head. "No, that is not possible." "The princess," she faltered, "doesn't look like you." "I know it seems strange," Iruma said gently, standing and approaching her maid. "But I promise you it is me. Something changed last night." But Ifoma wouldn't listen. Panic flashed across her face, and she turned abruptly towards the door, shouting, "Guards! Guards!" she cried. "No, wait," Iruma called after her. "Please, let me explain." But the former was already running towards the halls, her feet echoing down the stone corridors as she alerted the palace guards. It wasn't long before the guards came charging into Iruma's room. They surrounded her, their faces stern. "You are under arrest," one of them barked. "For what?" Iruma asked, bewildered. "For trespassing into the princess's chambers," the guard snapped. "What have you done with Princess Iruma?" "I am Princess Iruma," she pleaded, bewildered, her heart racing. But the guards exchanged doubtful glances. To them, the woman standing before them was a stranger, not the princess they knew. Without another word, they seized her arms and escorted her through the palace hall, ignoring her protest. Iruma was brought before her father, King Ibezwe, who stood at the center of the grand hall, his brow furrowed with worry and panic. When the guards pushed her forward, his stern gaze locked on her. "What have you done with my daughter?" the king demanded, his voice sharp with fear. "Father, it is me," Iruma cried. "I am your daughter." The king's eyes narrowed as he studied the beautiful young woman kneeling before him. "My daughter?" he echoed, shaking his head in disbelief. "You lie. My daughter does not look like you." Desperation welled in Iruma's heart. "I was made new," she exclaimed, her voice breaking. "Please, you must believe me. I am Iruma, your daughter, the one you reconciled with just a few days ago." But her father shook his head, his heart clouded with doubt and fear. "You expect me to believe that?" he thundered. He turned towards the guards and elders. "Search the palace. Find my daughter wherever she is." The guards scattered, their steps fading as they spread out to search the palace. Iruma stood in the grand hall, her heart pounding, her breath shallow. She looked desperately at her father, hoping for a flicker of recognition, but his face remained cold. Suddenly, the old healer who had attended the king during his illness stepped into the grand hall, his gaze lingering on Iruma, for he had been told of the commotion that had in the palace that morning. His brow furrowed in thought. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, "there is something familiar about her. Take a careful look of her eyes." King Ibezwe hesitated, but then slowly, reluctantly, he looked into her eyes, those same clear, doe-like eyes that had belonged to his wife, the eyes that had looked at him with love even after years of rejection. Recognition dawned slowly, like the first light of day breaking over the horizon. "Iruma," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. Iruma nodded, relief washing over her, tears filling her eyes. "Yes, father, it is me." The king's thin expression crumbled, replaced by disbelief and wonder. He stepped closer, his eyes trembling. "How? How can this be?" "I don't know, father," Iroma admitted, her voice soft, but somehow the change I felt inside has reflected outward. The king reached out, bringing her to her feet, his hands cupping her face, as if to confirm that she was truly real. And when he felt the warmth of her skin beneath his touch, his heart swelled with gratitude and awe. "Forgive me, my daughter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I did not recognize you. I could not. Not for who you were then, and not for who you have become now. But I see you now. I truly see you." Iruma smiled through her tears. "Thank you, father." Word of Iruma's transformation spread through the palace and beyond towards the whole kingdom. People marveled not only at her newfound beauty, but at the kindness and strength she carried within. Her sisters, once envious and cruel, kept their distance out of guilt and shame, while the king worked tirelessly to make amends for the years he had lost with her. Iruma, however, remained unchanged in spirit and in her attitude towards life. She continued to cherish the peace she had found within herself, choosing love over resentment and solitude over vanity. The transformation she had undergone was not merely of the body, but of the soul as well, a reflection of the woman she had always been. And though she stood radiant and whole, she never forgot the lessons she had learned in the shadows. As the years passed, Iruma became a beacon of wisdom and hope in the entire kingdom, a reminder to everyone that true beauty lies not in appearance, but in the heart. And in the quiet sanctuary of the library, where her journey had begun, Iruma found peace, knowing that she had finally become everything that she was meant to be. As the three old women concluded their story, there was silence everywhere as the children contemplated on the journey of Iruma. "The night air has become cool now," one of the children whispered. "So, Iruma became beautiful in the end?" "She did, child, but not because she sought it, and not because she was trying to be anything other than who she was. The beauty that mattered most was already inside her. That is the lesson, little one. The world is too quick to judge by what it sees alone, but it is what you carry within you that counts." Another boy, his face crunched in thought, asked, "But why didn't the king love her from the beginning? If she was so kind, he should have seen that, right?" Mama Gozie sighed and nodded. "Ah, but that is one of the sad truths of life, my dear. Sometimes people, even those who are supposed to love us, are blinded by their own expectations. The king only saw what he thought Iruma should be, not who she truly was. And by the time he realized his mistakes, many years had passed and damages had been done. But she forgave him even after everything. Yes, my child, she forgave him. She understood that holding on to anger would not change what had happened. Forgiveness is not just for the one being forgiven, it is also for the one who forgives. It gave her peace and settlement. But one of the children asked, trying to absorb the wisdom in the story, "The water, how did it change her?" "Well," Mama Obinna chuckled, "the water was special, yes, but it did not do all the work. Iruma's heart had changed long before her body did. The well's water only reflected what was already true inside her, that she had found peace with herself and chose to love in spite of everything." The children nodded slowly, their faces thoughtful as the weight of the story sank in. Mama Nkechi gave the children the last lesson. "Remember, little ones, the world will not always see you for who you are. People may judge you, ignore you, or fail to understand you, but that is not what matters most. What matters is how you see yourself and how you treat others, no matter how they treat you. Life will not always be fair, and not every story has a happy ending. But you must carry kindness within you like Iruma did. And one day, when the time is right, the world will see your light just like it saw hers. And if they don't see it, well, that is their loss. Your worth does not depend on anyone's opinion but your own. And that is the end of the story of the ugly princess. And so, as the moon rose above the village, the three old women shared a knowing smile, their hearts light and their spirits at peace as they waited for another day of story. The end.